The hangar fell silent, as cold and final as a tomb. In the center stood a gargantuan engine, a mountain of titanium draped in gray tarps. A yellow sign hung from a support strut. "Do not touch. Liquidation pending." The lead engineer simply turned his back and walked away. The CEO watched a $10 million loss vanish into the shadows. "We've tried everything," he sighed. "It's over." But near a stack of rusted oil drums, a single dad in oil-blackened overalls stood still. Michael Reyes didn't argue with data. He whispered, "It's not dead, it's just not being listened to." Michael Reyes was 39 years old, though the deep lines etched around his eyes made him look 50. He was a man whose presence was as quiet as a faded blueprint kept in a dark drawer. Officially, he was a short-term contract aviation mechanic, the kind of person firms hired to perform the grunt work, moving heavy parts, cleaning up toxic spills, and ensuring the tools were polished for the people who actually thought for a living. His skin was permanently stained with the stubborn scent of jet fuel and the thick grease of 1,000 forgotten machines. To the world of high-stakes aerospace engineering, Michael was just another body in a uniform, a nameless face in a sea of interchangeable labor. But behind those tired, bloodshot eyes was a mind that had once been sharp enough to design the very wings that carried thousands across the Atlantic. 12 years ago, Michael had been a rising star, a brilliant aerodynamicist with a promising future at a rival firm. That was before the world collapsed. He had walked away from it all, the prestige, the patents, the six-figure salary, to care for his wife, Elena, during her agonizing battle with a terminal illness. He had traded corporate boardrooms for sterile hospital hallways and complex fluid dynamics equations for the simple, heartbreaking rhythm of a breathing machine. The sacrifice hadn't just been professional. It was spiritual. He had watched his dreams of revolutionizing flight dissolve into the mundane reality of medical bills and sleepless nights. Every morning, he would look at the diplomas gathering dust in the attic, reminding him of a man he no longer recognized. Yet, looking at his daughter, he knew he would make the same choice 1,000 times over. After Elena passed away, Michael was left with a hollow chest and a daughter named Lily, who was now 7. Lily was a bright-eyed spark of energy who looked exactly like her mother, a constant living reminder of everything Michael had lost and everything he still had to protect. Raising her alone in a small, drafty apartment in the city meant taking whatever work he could find, regardless of how beneath him it might have seemed to his former colleagues. He didn't care about titles anymore. He didn't care about the prestige of being a lead engineer. He cared about the rising grocery bill, the rent that was always 2 weeks overdue, and the comforting warmth of Lily's small hand in his during their walk to the bus stop. The project currently tearing the aerospace firm apart was the Ares turbine, an experimental engine designed to be the first truly carbon-neutral propulsion system for commercial flight. It was a masterpiece of modern engineering, a mechanical titan that had already passed through the hands of 12 world-renowned experts, each more credentialed than the last, and each one had failed to make it roar. The technical records were a mountain of frustration. Hundreds of pages detailing error codes, sensor anomalies, and inexplicable system shutdowns. Every time they tried to ignite it, the onboard computers would scream a warning, and the massive blades would remain stubbornly, mockingly still. It was a haunted machine, a multi-million-dollar paperweight that had become a monument to corporate failure. For Michael, the news of the project's liquidation was more than just a corporate setback. It was a personal catastrophe. The cancellation of the Ares contract meant his temporary work would be terminated immediately. He would be back on the street, searching for work in an industry that had a very short memory for men who had dared to step away from the grind. He felt the cold breath of poverty on his neck, a fear that was far more visceral than any mechanical failure. Late one night, as he tucked Lily into her small bed, she noticed the shadows under his eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, "if the big machine is broken, why don't you just give up?" The other men did. Michael looked at her, his heart heavy. He thought of the weeks he'd spent watching the experts yell at their laptops while the engine sat silent. He thought of the way the engine seemed to hum, even when it wasn't on, a sound only he seemed to hear. He kissed her forehead. "Because, Lily, some things are worth the struggle, even when they can't speak for themselves. Sometimes the quietest things have the most to say." In the hangar the next morning, the atmosphere was poisonous. Senior engineers were packing their high-end leather bags, their voices filled with bitter, defensive excuses. They blamed the proprietary software. They blamed the quality of the fuel injectors. They blamed the very laws of physics. No one asked the guy with the broom what he thought. To them, Michael was part of the background noise, as irrelevant as a discarded bolt. But Michael knew something they didn't. He knew that machines, like people, have a way of hiding their deepest pain behind a wall of noise. The engine wasn't failing because it was broken. It was failing because it was misunderstood. He felt a strange, familiar pull in his chest, the same drive that had once made him a visionary. He wasn't doing this for a promotion. He was doing it because he couldn't let another thing he cared about die without a fight. The following day was a sweltering mess of administrative death. The hangar doors remained closed, and the ventilation had been turned off to save on overhead costs, making the space feel like a furnace. Marcus Thorne, the CEO, spent the morning pacing the perimeter of the engine like a caged predator. He was a man who lived by the gospel of numbers and aggressive timelines, and right now the numbers were shouting 0. Every diagnostic test run by the senior team yielded the same frustrating result. Status: non-responsive. The digital interfaces reported that every valve was open, every spark plug was firing, and every drop of fuel was pressurized. On paper, the Ares turbine was perfect. In reality, it was a cold, dead statue. The engineers began to argue loudly, their voices echoing off the metal rafters. One blamed the silicon in the sensors. Another blamed the atmospheric humidity. It was a wall of noise that solved nothing, a cacophony of ego. They were treating a physical masterpiece as if it were a glitchy video game, forgetting that metal has memory and mechanics have a soul. Michael stood on the periphery, leaning against a work table, a ghost in the machinery. He watched the way they handled the controls, rough, impatient, and fueled by a desperate desire to be right rather than a desire to understand. He saw them slamming keys and resetting the software over and over, hoping for a miracle through sheer repetition. They were treating the engine like a disobedient child. Michael realized the fundamental flaw. They were obsessed with the data on the screens. They were looking at a digital ghost of the engine, but they were ignoring the physical reality of the metal itself. As the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the hangar floor, Thorne finally stopped pacing. He looked at the lead engineer, a man named Henderson. "That's it," Thorne said, his voice flat and drained of all hope. "Strip it down. We're selling the titanium for scrap. I'm not wasting another cent on this ghost." The team began to disperse, a sense of grim relief washing over them. They were finally free from the impossible engine. Michael waited until the hangar was nearly empty, the only sound being the distant hum of the security lights flickering on. He saw the foreman, a gruff man named Miller, heading for the exit. "Can I stay for a bit?" Michael asked quietly. "I need to finish inventorying the tools." Miller, too tired to care about company policy, just waved a hand dismissively. "Whatever, Reyes. Just don't break anything else. Security locks up at midnight. Don't get trapped in here with that piece of junk." Once the heavy steel doors clicked shut, Michael was alone with the Titan. The silence was absolute, a heavy, pressurized quiet that made his ears ring. He didn't go to the computer console. He didn't plug in a diagnostic tool. Instead, he pulled a small, portable work light over to the side of the engine and turned it on. He didn't want the harsh, clinical overhead glare. He wanted to see the shadows in the crevices. He reached out and touched the main drive shaft, his fingers feeling the cold, smooth texture of the polished steel. He didn't try to start it. He simply grabbed the manual rotation handle, a massive iron bar designed for emergency maintenance, and began to turn the engine by hand. It was a slow, grueling process. He had to put his entire weight into the lever, his muscles screaming as he forced the massive internal components to move. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction from his mental exhaustion. With every turn, he felt as if he were reconnecting with his own dormant potential. He closed his eyes. He didn't need to see. He needed to feel the resonance. As the blades moved slowly, he felt the resistance in the gears. He felt the way the lubricating oil moved through the lines. And then, he heard it. A sound so faint it was almost a vibration rather than a noise, a tiny rhythmic tink that happened exactly once every 3 rotations. It was a metallic heartbeat that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a grind, and it wasn't a escape. It was a hesitation. Michael stopped, his heart racing. He rotated it back and then forward again. There it was, a micro-stutter in the synchronization. He remembered his father, a master mechanic in a small-town garage, once telling him, "Machines talk, son. If you rush, you'll never hear them. But if you give them time, they'll tell you exactly where it hurts." Michael realized that the high-speed sensors were too sophisticated for their own good. They were programmed to look for major failures: pressure drops, heat spikes, electrical shorts. They were looking for an explosion, but the problem was a whisper. The computers were looking at the destination, but the problem was in the very first step of the journey. The elite engineers had built a system so complex, it had blinded them to the simplicity of basic mechanics. He spent the next 5 hours meticulously disassembling a small section of the fuel housing, a part that the digital records claimed had been cleared a dozen times. He didn't use power tools. He used hand wrenches, feeling the tension in every bolt. When he finally reached the internal valve seat, he saw it. A tiny microscopic burr of metal, no larger than a grain of sand, lodged in the seat of the primary injector. It was a manufacturing flaw, so small it didn't prevent the valve from closing, but it delayed the closure by a fraction of a millisecond. In the world of high-performance turbines rotating at 30,000 RPM, a millisecond was an eternity. The machine's safety software was sensing the tiny imbalance and shutting everything down to prevent a catastrophic failure. The engine wasn't broken. It was protecting itself from a ghost. Michael carefully removed the tiny piece of metal with a pair of fine-tipped tweezers. It looked like nothing. It looked like a mistake. But to the engine, it had been a mountain. He cleaned the valve, lubricated the gears with the care of a surgeon, and began the slow process of reassembly. He wasn't thinking about Thorne's deadline or the $10 million. He was thinking about how Elena's breathing had changed in the final weeks, a subtle shift that told him more than any doctor's chart. He was thinking about the importance of being present when everything else tells you to leave. As the final bolt clicked into place, he felt a strange sense of peace. He hadn't just fixed a machine, he had reclaimed a part of himself. The morning after Michael's long night, the hangar was transformed into a boardroom for the condemned. Marcus Thorne arrived with a phalanx of lawyers and liquidation experts, all carrying briefcases filled with the paperwork required to kill a dream. The atmosphere was sterile, punctuated by the scratching of expensive pens and the cold rustle of legal documents. The senior engineers were already clearing out their lockers, their faces reflecting a mixture of boredom and professional embarrassment. No one noticed Michael. He was standing by the engine, his overalls more grease-stained than ever, his eyes bloodshot from 36 hours without sleep. He waited for a break in the legal jargon, then stepped forward into the circle of power. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that cut through the room. "I'd like to request 10 minutes for a final test." The lead engineer, Henderson, let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Reyes, don't be a hero. We've run 1,000 tests. The thing is a 6-ton brick. Go back to your inventory. This is for professionals now." Michael didn't even look at Henderson. He kept his eyes locked on Thorne. 10 minutes, sir. If it doesn't start, I'll personally help with the scrapping, and I'll waive my final week's pay. No cost to the company." Thorne looked at the clock, then at the exhausted man standing before him. There was something in Michael's gaze, a terrifying level of conviction that he hadn't seen in any of his PhD-holding consultants. "Fine," Thorne said, checking his watch. 10 minutes, but make it fast. The lawyers have a flight to catch." Henderson rolled his eyes and sat at the main console, his fingers hovering over the keys with lazy indifference. "Here we go again," he muttered. "Recording failure 101. But Michael didn't let him push the final button. "I'll engage it from the manual override," Michael said. He walked over to the side of the engine, far away from the glowing computer screens. He didn't look at the digital readouts. He placed his bare hand on the metal casing, feeling the temperature of the room. He closed his eyes, imagined the fuel flowing through the valve he had cleaned, and whispered, "Now." He engaged the manual starter. For a heartbeat, there was only the familiar, high-pitched whine of the electric motor. Then, a hesitation. Henderson smirked. "See? Same old." But then, the sound changed. The whine didn't cut out. It deepened into a guttural thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor and into the bones of every person in the room. A small, clean puff of white exhaust blossomed from the rear nozzle. And then, with a sound like a thunderclap muffled by miles of velvet, the engine roared to life. It was a magnificent noise. It wasn't the jagged, screaming sound of a struggling machine. It was a smooth, melodic hum, a mechanical choir that felt as solid as a mountain. The digital screens at the console began to light up in a frantic, beautiful dance of green. RPMs climbing steadily. Core temperature stabilizing perfectly. Vibration levels lower than anything they had ever recorded in the simulations. The room seemed to expand with the power of the Ares turbine, the very air ionized by its success. The lawyers stopped talking. The engineers stopped packing. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his face illuminated by the green glow of the monitors, his mouth hanging open in pure, unadulterated disbelief. It's perfect," he whispered. After 5 minutes of flawless operation, Michael reached out and shut the engine down. The silence that followed was even more powerful than the roar. Thorne turned to Michael, his eyes searching the man's face. "How?" he asked, his voice shaking. "We had the best sensors in the world. We had supercomputers. How did you find what they missed?" Michael looked at his grease-stained hands. "Your sensors are looking for errors in logic," he said quietly. "But an engine isn't just logic. It's a physical body. There was a burr in the injector seat, too small for the sensors to flag as a failure, but big enough for the metal to feel. Everyone was looking at the data. I was just listening to the machine." Michael then looked at Henderson. "I tried to point out the vibration in the first month, sir, but you told me to stick to my broom. I'm just a contract mechanic. In this hangar, my opinion didn't have a data point, so it didn't exist." The silence in the room became heavy with the weight of 100 ignored opportunities. Michael continued, his voice taking on a depth that commanded the room. "For a year, I sat next to my wife's bed. I learned to tell the difference between a breath that meant she was sleeping and a breath that meant she was in pain. I learned that anything, a person or a machine, will tell you everything if you have the patience to stay still and listen. I didn't learn that in an engineering school. I learned it from love and loss. You can't program empathy into a sensor, Mr. Thorne. And you can't find the truth if you're too busy being the loudest person in the room." The news of the successful test spread through the aerospace industry like a shock wave. By noon, the $10 million contract had been saved. The lawyers had been sent home, and the company's stock was soaring. Henderson was quietly asked to resign. The hangar, once a tomb, was now a cathedral of innovation. Marcus Thorne, however, wasn't interested in the press releases. He spent the afternoon in his office, staring at Michael Reyes's employment file. He saw the gaps. He saw the brilliant early career and the sudden drop into manual labor. He saw the man who had traded his future for a woman who was dying. Thorne realized he had been looking for a genius in a suit, but he had found a master in overalls. He saw that Michael's resume wasn't defined by the companies he had worked for, but by the integrity he had maintained during his darkest hours. He called Michael into his office. Michael sat down, looking out of place in the leather and chrome luxury of the executive suite. "Mr. Reyes," Thorne began, "I'm not going to apologize for the past. I'm a businessman, but I don't make the same mistake twice. I'm offering you the position of Chief of Technical Operations, a salary 5 times what you're making now, a full benefits package, and your own research team. You won't have to touch a broom ever again." He pushed a contract across the desk. It was the return of the life Michael had once walked away from. It was security, comfort, and the ability to give Lily everything he had dreamed of. Michael looked at the paper for a long time. He thought about the small apartment. He thought about the worn-out shoes Lily was wearing. Then, he looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3:45 p.m. "I have one condition," Michael said. Thorne nodded. "Anything? A signing bonus? A bigger lab?" Michael leaned forward. "Can I leave by 4:30 every day?" Thorne paused, a look of confusion crossing his face. "Michael, I'm offering you a $1 million career. Most men in that position work 70 hours a week. Why 4:30? "Because my daughter gets off the bus at 4:45, Michael replied. "She's lost her mother, Mr. Thorne. She's not going to lose her father to a company, no matter how much you pay him. If the job means I miss her childhood, then the job is a failure. Those are my terms." The room was silent. Thorne, a man who had sacrificed 2 marriages and his relationship with his own children to his ambition, felt a sudden, sharp pang of regret. He realized that the very thing that made Michael a great mechanic, his capacity for devotion, was the very thing that made him refuse the typical corporate trap. He was witnessing a man who understood the true value of time, a currency far more precious than any stock option. "Done," Thorne said, grabbing a pen and crossing out the standard hours clause. 4:30 every day. No exceptions. If we have a crisis, it can wait until the morning. Because if you're right about listening, then we probably need the quiet anyway. That evening, Michael arrived home at exactly 4:45 p.m. He was standing on the sidewalk when the yellow bus pulled up. Lily jumped off the steps, her backpack bouncing, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Daddy, you're home!" Michael swung her around, the weight of his daughter the only thing in the world that truly mattered. "Did you fix the big machine?" she asked. Michael nodded, a lump in his throat. "I did, Lily. And it fixed us too." As they sat at their small kitchen table, Michael realized the engine hadn't just been a mechanical problem. It had been a mirror. It had reflected his own state, ignored, draped in a tarp, and marked as broken by a world that only valued what it could measure. By listening to the engine, he had finally allowed himself to be heard. He understood that the Ares turbine was a symbol for every person who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. The culture of the firm changed overnight. Thorne ordered a complete overhaul of their protocols. Every project was now required to have a listening phase, a period where the machines were operated at low speeds and analyzed by human touch and hearing before the computers were even turned on. He created a Human Element Award, and he made sure that the people on the front lines had a direct line to his office. He began to value the intuition of the workers over the predictions of the algorithms. Michael didn't change his habits. He still wore his old overalls, even as chief of operations. He still ate his lunch on the same toolbox in the corner of the hangar, staying humble because he knew how quickly the world could take everything away. He became a legend, not for his salary, but for his wisdom. He taught a new generation of engineers that a degree was just a piece of paper, but a calloused hand was a library of experience. He mentored young engineers, teaching them that the most important tool in their kit wasn't a laptop, but their own senses. The story of the single dad and the impossible engine didn't end with a medal. It ended with a quiet life and a happy daughter. He proved that kindness, patience, and the willingness to see value in what others have abandoned are the most important tools any man can own. He showed the world that brilliance doesn't always come with a title. Sometimes it comes with a smudge of grease and a heart that refuses to give up. In the end, we are all like that engine. We all have moments when we feel broken, when our systems are failing, and when the world is ready to scrap us. But if we are lucky, we will find someone like Michael, someone who isn't afraid of our silence, someone who will stay with us in the dark, and someone who will place a hand on our heart and simply listen. Because when someone truly hears you, you find the strength to roar. True progress isn't just about moving faster or building bigger. It's about remembering the human heartbeat inside the machine. Chai TL Stories. If you love stories about perseverance and love, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any healing stories from us. Your support is the motivation for HITL Stories to continue our journey of sharing human values. Thank you for listening.